right, good afternoon or good morning to everyone who's joining us online from wherever you're joining us across APAC. We'll have a prompt start as we have a lot of exciting conversation to get through over the next 30 minutes. So welcome to the third part in our series on supply chains. Over the last 2 weeks, my colleagues have been discussing topics like assessing supply chain risk, in relation to climate-related risks and opportunities, and how to measure emissions in the supply chain with accuracy. And I'm very happy to be with you today to discuss part 3 on the theme of decarbonising and engaging your supply chain. So you will have noted that you will have joined on an auto mute setting, and due to the large group joining us today, you'll stay that way for the course of the 30 minutes, but we really still welcome you to please engage with us via the questions box. Please ask questions throughout the session, and towards the end, we will try and get through as many questions as possible. So please do engage with us via the questions box. Also, the session will be recorded and we'll be sure to share it with all of you afterward. So a few quick introductions. My name is Sonia Sampson. I have the pleasure of being your host for today. I'm a senior manager in climate advisory in Sydney, and I'm joined by my colleague Lyra Pinto, a principal consultant in climate advisory from Singapore, and also very proud to welcome Leslie John, the sustainability manager from GrainCorp, and we'll have the opportunity to hear from him as well. But Lyra, I'd like to hand over to you to kick us off today.
Thank you, Sonia and Leslie, and hello everyone. Welcome to this final webinar of the supply chain series. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about one of the most interesting and potentially the most challenging, engaging pieces of the climate journey, which is engaging with our suppliers and implementing projects on the ground. So, for those of you who have joined previous webinars, you would have seen the first webinar talking about assessing risks and preparing the groundwork, while the second one took us through some of the processes, best practices in measuring our value chain emissions. So this entire series, and today in particular, is going to focus on this very interesting beast that we call Scope 3, and which requires so much collaboration, engagement, participation from all of the stakeholders in our value chain, and not just the company itself. So if we start to approach this point, and let's assume that we are approaching this from the perspective of a company that has done the first few steps. So let's imagine that our basic risk analysis is completed. We have our needs assessment completed as well. And we've taken those initial steps to set a baseline and measure our value chain emissions. Now what? What's the next step? So just by that very fact of having set our baseline and having assessed our risks, most companies by this point will already see the opportunities that present themselves for decarbonization. So some of the really common ones are process efficiencies and renewable energy. So these are very deeply related to scope 1 and 2, to our own operations and things that we can do ourselves. For companies who are in land-related sectors, also quite interesting to look at removals in this space, maybe regenerative agriculture or water stewardship with your farmers or suppliers. Irrespective of sector, traceability of our value chains and the commodities that we source is quite important, and securing traceability often enables us to set the stepping stones for other more intensive work with our suppliers. And then finally, nature, biodiversity, and other co-benefits, which are really worthwhile projects to do, may not necessarily be quantified in terms of carbon reductions or decarbonization, but are still really valuable in order to secure our supply chains and build our supplier relationships. So at this point of having assessed our risks, measured our emissions, and now we're standing here ready to engage and decarbonize, let's imagine that we're in a scenario where a company already has some idea of what the opportunities are. So the question is, where do we go from here? Well, the most critical point before we get to where do we go from here is to remember that decarbonizing our value chains is a process of continuous improvement. And what that means is that we are not going to get all of the data, all of the information exactly right at the first go. And the reason why this is important is that quite a few companies get stuck at the measurement stage, and very understandably so, because a lot of work would have gone into measurement, a lot of work would have gone into that intensive data collection and pushing for accuracy. And very often we get stuck at the point of how can I take action when I don't have a perfect baseline or when I don't have full supplier information? How do I go ahead? So, of course, the risk is that we get stuck at that point and continue to refine and refine and refine data of a baseline that's maybe 1 or 2 years old and really pour all of our resources into perfecting the measurement rather than moving ahead. The balance to strike here is that we do need enough information and enough investment in that measurement phase to know where we are. But we do need to remember that that's about where we are. That's not about where we're going. And the focus of engagement and implementation is to get us there and drive us towards those targets. So once we have a fair amount of confidence in our baseline and all of the necessary best practices have been achieved, at least at the minimum level to tell us where we are, it's time to think about strategizing and look at what the opportunities are for reductions and removals, identify what are the priority areas that we want to work on. Once that piece is done, and again, keeping in mind that this is a process of improvement and we will not have a perfect strategy or a perfect roadmap at the first cut, with those opportunities in mind, we can already start to reach out to our value chain, reach out to our suppliers, our customers, other players, and engage with them to understand where they are. So that could be something as basic as trying to understand, does anyone have similar targets to we do? Does anyone already have a sustainability program that we can leverage? Are there common goals or common opportunities or common interests? And from there, once we understand where our partners stand, we can start to work towards developing project plans, implementation plans, understanding incentive schemes, and really getting to that critical point and close the circle finally and come back to measure the impact of all of our projects. So really important preliminary to keep in mind. It's never going to be a perfect start, and it's never going to be a perfect process with fully accurate data all through. But the key is to keep moving and improving and increasing our accuracy year on year. So let's dig a little deeper into this strategize piece. So when we think about strategizing and preparing for engagement and implementation, essentially what this involves is identifying the priority hotspots, which is where are our emissions coming from? Where are the biggest areas of concern? Where are the biggest risks? Harking back to workshop one, where are the biggest risks where we impact ecosystems, where we impact the system we're living in, and where does the system impact us? So identifying those hotspots, understanding the scale of action required. This means if we're looking at a specific commodity or a specific part of our business operations, do we need to engage with 3 big suppliers who dominate our business, or are we talking 500 small providers? So what is the scale of the action that we need to prepare for? And then finally, what's the timeline that measures should be implemented in? There are some measures which will give us payoffs in the short run. Things like energy switches, fuel switches can really give us those benefits within a couple of years. And then there are interventions that give us payoffs in the long run. So things like land-related interventions or infrastructure-related interventions may take time to come through, but when they do come through, those payoffs are big. So what's the timeline within which we want to implement our projects? Putting these few core areas together, we can start to build a roadmap to get towards our goals. So if we look at this little illustration here, the left side of the graph tells us where we are today and where we would reach if we did nothing. So that's the business as usual scenario. We continue working, with our impacts, with all of our operations as usual, and potentially within 25 or 30 years time, our emissions would be much higher than they are today. Whereas where we need to be is for companies that have set targets. This might be your net zero target. It might be a public announcement that you've made. It might even be your internal, sustainability or climate plan that you haven't announced, but that your stakeholders are invested in. And to close this gap of where we need to be, whereas what would happen if we did nothing, these are the basic essential steps that we will want to look at. So understand our hotspots, understand the scale and impact of the actions, how feasible these actions are, what's the timeline, and what are the resources, which is the time, energy, team members, skills that we need to put in to implement these projects. Once we have that outline of a roadmap in mind, the next step, of course, is to share this with our stakeholders. Because the value chain impacts are so widespread and because they require collaboration, very often a lot of companies may not even be able to articulate to their partners in the value chain where they're going and what they want to achieve, and making sure that those partners understand what we want to achieve and understand what we're working towards is really the first step in getting them on board. Because once we share and communicate our targets and roadmaps, then we start to get an idea of who is willing to collaborate with us. Maybe there's someone who has similar goals, maybe there's someone who's already started thinking on those lines. So this first phase of reaching out to our partners and engaging with them helps us to answer some of these key questions. Who should we partner with? Where and when? Is there a specific country? Are there specific operational sites? Does, let's say, a certain region have a great scheme for renewable energy where we can partner with our suppliers and make things happen? What are the roles of each partner? And then coming back to close the circle of measurements, how do we account for impacts and make sure these projects are on track? So this is the engage phase. And digging a little deeper, because the obvious question is, we have so many partners in different parts of the business, how do we even begin to engage? It's definitely not a simple process, but it can be broken down into a logical flow. So when developing a supplier engagement approach, the first step that we would encourage anyone to do is to identify and map your partners. So if we have a specific hotspot, let's say transportation, or let's say purchased goods and services, very common hotspot for everybody. Who are those key partners? Who are those 10 suppliers who have the greatest volume, the greatest emissions, the greatest impact, the most strategic contractual relationships? Once we know who are our priority partners, then we can start to develop a benchmark. And by a benchmark, we mean where do these partners stand in relation to the company itself? So we might find that there are some partners who are really mature and maybe even 3 steps ahead of us and are already doing things that can be replicated elsewhere. And then there may be partners who are really promising and they want to work with us, but they're tiny suppliers who don't have any resources. And there may be some who are ready to go, but they need guidance, or some who are just not ambitious and they're not there yet. So understanding where they all stand, benchmarking them, gives us then an indication of the next stage, which is how do we engage with them? So which are the partners whom we can engage at a more implementation and technical level and talk about delivery and action plans? And which are the ones where we start 3 steps behind and we begin by training and education and scoping what they're able to do? So with these initial steps, we can focus on specific parts of the operation. We can focus on specific hotspots, so maybe a commodity or a process that a lot of your suppliers are engaged in, or maybe specific opportunities that you know of in your business. So for example, let's say packaging. If you know that there is a lot of opportunity with your packaging suppliers, there's easily a switch you can make. You might want to start by looking at that hotspot. So already this is starting to narrow down our landscape from the massive value chain of operations, how many hundreds of suppliers, to a smaller and smaller bucket that allows us to start. So really critical to start, and then we can continue to refine and build on that. Now, assuming that we have done these initial stages, we have reached to this point where we know our 5, 8, 10, maximum 20 key partners to begin with. This is where we can think about implementation. There are a couple of steps here, and these steps are really project specific. There may be some things that can be done quite easily, and then there may be others that need a lot more planning. So for example, if we are doing a land-based project, let's say it's a food company or someone who needs to do interventions on farm, this could involve a significant amount of planning. We'd want to understand what's the potential for reductions, what's the potential for impact. Is the project aligned with relevant guidelines? Is the project constructed in such a way that it will sustain itself and continue to function over the next 5 years? So assessing the impacts and the requirements of the project, designing the project itself, so planning how we are going to implement this for the next 5, 6, 10 years, the roles of every stakeholder, the action plan, and then incentivizing our partners. So let's say if a partner is delivering a project, are we going to co-invest with them? Are we going to give them a preferential contract? Are we going to give them a preferential price for their item? What's the incentive plan to keep our partners along with this? Then, of course, the fun stage, which is implement, make it happen, deploy the teams, deploy the resources, get it done. And then closing the circle back to monitoring, reporting, and making sure we have that data so we can claim those reductions in our next year's inventory. We can report on them and generally share the great work that our partners are doing, continue to move on from there. So this is an extremely condensed snapshot of this cycle of engagement and implementation. Of course, this differs by company, differs by commodity, differs by your supplier profile. But if there's one thing that you would take away from this message, it's act now. Don't wait for a perfect baseline. Don't wait for a perfect data. Get informed enough and begin. Because although it looks difficult, what we often see is when we start engagement, a lot of partners are really quite enthusiastic and happy to find that companies want to go with them on this journey. So with that said, back to you, Sonia, and now we can hear from Leslie and go into more of the questions. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lara. I think that was really helpful and some really good tips there. And that's really laid a great foundation for our Q&A session with Leslie. Before we jump into that, just a reminder, if there is a question anyone has while listening to this, please make sure to add it to the question box and we'll try and get to it before the end. But now I'd like to welcome Leslie. So Leslie John is GrainCorp Sustainability Manager and a climate change specialist with a strong technical and engineering background. He has several years of experience working with both large private and public organizations to set net zero targets, develop comprehensive decarbonisation plans, and conduct emissions footprinting. He's passionate about advancing practical climate solutions and committed to making a long-term impact in sustainability. It's such a pleasure to have you with us here today, Leslie. And if you're ready, we can jump into the first question.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Sonia. And yeah, let's jump right in.
Great. So let's maybe start broad. Could you share a brief overview of GrainCorp's value chain and the partners that you have both upstream, so suppliers, and downstream, thinking about customers, and how you might go about communicating with them about your decarbonisation and sustainability goals?
Yeah, for sure. And I think before we get into the upstream and downstream partners, it's important to discuss what GrainCorp does at a very, very high level. And just to simplify in one sentence. So GrainCorp is an agribusiness and processing organization operating across different sectors of business units. So energy, human nutrition, and animal nutrition. So we have a wide range of partners, both upstream and customers downstream. So it's a very diversified portfolio for us. And in terms of partners and customers in particular, so our upstream activities are primarily involved in sourcing grains, oil seeds, and other kind of agricultural products. So which is primarily from farmers and growers all across the globe. We are also relying heavily on third-party logistics for our transportation and distribution as well. So it's inclusive of shipping, road transports, and railway as well. So those would be our key partners upstream. And whereas in the downstream side of things, as I mentioned, we are somewhere in the midstream of the whole of agricultural value chain. And what that means is most of the products or commodities that come out of our facility are intermediate goods, which require further processing. So that goes downstream into our customers' facilities, which is, such as biorefineries, so for fuel production, or, further transforming the grains into flour or other kind of, crushing units as well. So those would be our other downstream type of customers and partners. And again, there's a significant amount of transportation distribution associated with, moving our goods from our facility all the way to the client. The second part of the question is about communicating to our partners. So how we generally do that, what comes to my mind firstly is we publish annual reports every year where we talk about our progress, our strategies, and it's all aligned to international framework. So what that means is it helps us to provide a story and also kind of communicate our priorities for the upcoming year, what we have done in the last year, and how we would like to get support from our partners as well. We also regularly organize workshops and stakeholder workshops with our partners, so such as growers, other kind of customers and partners, constantly discussing about sustainability topics. So these sessions are usually focused on reducing emissions, developing collaborative strategies to support decarbonization throughout the value chain. We also engage directly with suppliers and customers through advisory programs, partnerships, and operational support as well, which has kind of helped us in co-developing practical solutions that align with, the shared decarbonization goal in the agricultural sector. And I think finally, it's also important to call out we are part of many of the government-related forums or mechanisms such as the voluntary GHG emissions reporting standard reference group, which has helped us to be in the forefront in developing methodologies and guidelines. So putting us out there in terms of what we are trying to do and trying to bring that consistency and methodology in terms of calculating our emissions footprint, but also where we want to go with this. So yeah.
Well, it was very comprehensive, and of course, not an easy sector you're in, but it's clear that GrainCorp's doing a lot. And I wanted to touch on something you mentioned around co-creating solutions and also your involvement in different forums and bodies. So maybe just getting a bit more into that, could you share a specific example of a collaboration GrainCorp has where you've looked at accelerating decarbonization in your sector?
Yeah. So it's a very exciting space to be at because there's a lot of work that's going in the background. And I think one of the prime examples that comes to my mind is, our collaboration with Ampol and IFM. So we have recently kind of published about, aimed at developing the renewable fuels industry in Australia. So this initiative was focused in producing SAF and renewable diesel from agricultural feedstock. And it's primarily to create new market opportunities and add value for Australian farmers and feedstock producers. So with this collaboration, GrainCorp wants to leverage the experience or expertise that we have in the agribusiness, feedstock supply capabilities, and expanding our oil crushing operations. While our partners such as Ampol contributes, obviously, as you know, its extensive infrastructure and distribution network for refining and delivering these fuels. The success of this partnership stems truly from the complementary strengths that we have. So as I mentioned, the agribusiness expertise, Ampol's market access, and IFM's financial backing. Together, we kind of align across the value chain to include, growers, fuel producers, and government bodies to create a domestic renewable fuel ecosystem. So that's just one example of, how we are working together to to resolve a very difficult problem in the transport sector, and also create value for growers who's upstream as well. So that's just one part of it, but there are so many other projects such as methane inhibitors that we are working on, or low emission canola as well. So there's quite a bit that's going on in the background, but yeah, I would say that that's one of the examples that I can provide.
I think it's a great example. It is a very exciting example and very topical as well, with its link into the aviation sector. And talking about the successful example involving some external stakeholders, I think maybe a good follow-on question is, we know, and Lyra's touched on the fact that value chain decarbonization also requires buy-in from your internal stakeholders. So maybe you could talk a bit more about some of your strategies for engaging your leadership internally as part of your value chain engagement.
Yeah, look, so investing in value chain decarbonization, as you mentioned, requires broad buy-in from stakeholders throughout the company. It's not just the sustainability team. So to engage the leadership and secure this participation, what we have done, or what I would like to highlight is, first and foremost, executive sponsorship and cross-functional accountability. So what that basically means is members of our ELT or executive leadership team acts as sponsors for sustainability initiatives, ensuring that we have ownership of key projects across the departments. So these leaders oversee the working groups that focus on strategic priorities such as climate change, sustainable procurement, nature, and so on, and driving alignment between commercial objectives and sustainability goals, while integrating, value chain engagement across functions like procurement and operations. The second one, which I believe is key, is aligning executive remuneration with sustainability outcomes as well. So one of the effective ways that we have engaged leadership is by aligning, as I mentioned, the incentives with sustainability outcomes. So our remuneration framework incorporates sustainability and climate-related considerations as well, motivating senior leaders to drive initiatives related to value chain decarbonization. the final one, I believe, is the workshop and internal collaboration. And as Lyra mentioned, it's sustainability is a collaborative effort. So we regularly host workshops and planning sessions with leaders across the company to explore climate and sustainability opportunities. But we also work closely with them and different functions to demonstrate how sustainability can unlock, benefits and opportunities in their respective areas as well.
Very broad, and again, lots of bits and pieces that you're bringing together to achieve your goals. It's actually very impressive. And I think what's clear through this conversation is that you're part of quite a complex value chain. Also, your position in the value chain is quite interesting. So given all that, maybe you could just share a bit more about how you go about even prioritizing who your key partners are, or what your focus areas are, in trying to sort of define how you can prioritize your efforts.
Yeah. Again, I think Lara had given a very good introduction to, how you prioritize them. But, given our position and the way that we have done, we have initially mapped out our value chain to identify emissions across our various activities and regions. So with a particular focus on scope 3 and emissions hotspots. So this analysis kind of helped us in pinpointing areas where our operations and those of our partners are most significant. Then we also conduct materiality assessments to determine ESG topics most relevant to our business and stakeholders. So the assessments help in highlighting partners or areas with high environmental and financial impacts to guide our prioritization efforts. Our initiatives also align with our strategic sustainability priorities, which, as I mentioned, it includes climate action, sustainable agriculture, and responsible sourcing. So partners that play a critical role in these areas are prioritized, enabling us to, direct resources towards the collaboration that provide more strategic value for both GrainCorp, but also for the broader value chain. And then finally, a really interesting piece that we are working on is we have started our work on climate-related impacts through scenario analysis. So going forward, especially in the agribusiness space, what we feel is that we will prioritize partners in areas that are more exposed to environmental risks, such as extreme weather disruption, as I mentioned, since we are heavily reliant on third-party logistics, growers, and the variability in climate and its impact on agriculture. So addressing these risks, I believe will not only enhance sustainability outcome, but also help us in business resilience.
Wow, very nicely said. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't make time to ask you what might be a burning question for some of the people on the line is, given your experience and all the work GrainCorp's doing in this space, do you have any advice or recommendations for companies that might be starting out on their sustainability or supply engagement journey?
Yeah, I think I feel like no one has a golden key for scope 3 emission decarbonization. It's all about collaboration. But especially people or entities with diverse emissions and hotspots across their value chain, starting out can be quite complex. So what we believe is it's really important to understand where you are in the whole value chain and what impacts you have itself. So if you're starting out now, it is very likely that there are people in your value chain that has steps ahead of you. So learning from them, but also collaborating with them can be highly impactful for you, and it can support your decarbonization journey as well. It can be a journey that you guys take together, but apart from that, the same steps of mapping out your hotspots, and it's more about completeness in this journey. That what we have realized is it's not always about getting that data complete and having the methodology right in the first instance. It's about completeness and understanding where your hotspots are and finding resources diverted to those hotspots and improving and refining those emission sources as time goes, which is exactly as Lara mentioned as well. Apart from that, I believe setting realistic targets aligned to science-based initiatives can really push and provide that momentum for you to kind of map out what your near-term targets are and how best you can achieve net zero targets. So it's an effort that you can put towards decarbonizing as well. And I think one more I would like to call out is collaborating with industry groups and platforms, because it's really valuable to put yourself out there and collaborate with other industry partners who are really leaders in the space and have as much as learning and understanding from their perspective, but also share your journey with them, so that you're doing this journey together. And again, sustainability does not happen in silos. It's a collaborative effort, and that's the way I would look at it.
That's such good advice. I think the three things I heard you say was it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and also the importance of doing it together and then setting targets to track along the way. Thank you so much for your time, Leslie. And we have come to the end of our time engagement with all of you. But if you have submitted a question, we will get back to you specifically with an answer. But I think we can all agree that there was lots to take from that. So thank you for sharing that with us, Leslie. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you for your time, Lara, and to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much. And please do reach out if any of our webinars have raised any questions for you. Until then, have a good day. Bye-bye.